Um, Thank you, Ritson. My name is Jessica Guadalupe Vargas. I'm the Qualitative Data Strategist at the To&Through project, and I'll be your host for this afternoon. So before we jump into learning about the beautiful reports, I'm gonna do some brief announcements and then pass it off to PCC and the Here Lab to talk about the research report, and then we'll end with the Q&A feature, a Q&A conversation at the end. So that's to say, you can help facilitate the Q&A by submitting questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So just highly encourage folks to submit your questions. If it's a fairly clarifying question or easy question, Giselle is going to be answering clarifying questions throughout the presentation or the PCC team. But if it's a bigger question, we'll save it for the end for our Q&A. So with that, because I'm really excited and want to get the presentation going, if you're new here, welcome. A little bit about the To&Through project. We are a research slash database organization housed at the University of Chicago, and we believe that by leveraging data, both qualitative and quantitative, we can help build more equitable outcomes for Chicago public school students. And I'm really excited for this report because it aligns with a lot of the work that I've done with student stories. So student stories is they're real stories from real students. I interview Chicago public school students slash alumni about their life in CPS and their life after high school graduation, which a lot of them focuses on college. And the number one thing that students mention throughout the years across all 42 stories is their struggle with financial aid and financial aid resources and the access that and the challenges that they face when they're persisting in college. Many of the people that I interview are students of color, first generation, low income students, students from immigrant backgrounds, whose families have historically been denied access to build generational wealth. And so many of the students are the first in their families to have the access to college to try to build that generational wealth for themselves and for their family and for, the future family members after them. And so having the conversation about wealth specifically today really addresses a lot of the needs that students have been mentioning for years. So I'm really excited that that's being addressed here and today. Also, we're big fans of PCC. They've been great collaborators in the work, and so I'm also excited because they're some of my favorite people. Um, ¿Qué más? Okay, To&Through events. So, we love to host events and conversations where we build community together with one another. And so, a couple of events that you can sign up for is number one, February Data Collaborative, which are more small group conversations where an organization comes and presents a project or idea that they want feedback on. And on February, we're going to be hosting Hope Chicago. Super exciting. And then later this month, we're going to have a presentation in collaboration with Chicago Public Schools on supporting college success for Black graduates of Chicago Public Schools. This event is also going to be especially cool because we're going to have a student panel at the end. So um, I invite you all to join this one, especially. And then we also have our March Data Collaborative, where our City Colleges of Chicago will be presenting. Luis, I don't know if you're here, but hi. And last but not least, we have a To&Through milestone tool super user workshop. So if you're familiar with To&Through, you're probably familiar with our quantitative resource, which is the milestone tool. But do you think you know everything about the tool? Maybe you do, but come find out remotely during this Zoom session. And I do have one event, maybe Ritson, you can share it in the chat, but we will also be hosting end of year sort of celebration convening of our data collaboratives in June. And so that one's not published on our website, but you can be one of the first people to sign up on Eventbrite in the link in the chat that Ritson shared below. So yeah, sign up for these events. We love seeing people virtually, in person, um, to have great conversations. And with that, talking about, great people, I'm going to introduce our amazing presenters of the day. So I'm going to start off with, let me get the bios. I'm so sorry, y'all. I thought I had it. Oh no, did I lose the bios? My bad, y'all. I did. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment. I apologize. I Was doing a lot of things at once. ¿Dónde voy? Tech prep. Okay. A little dramatic entrance there. So the first person I'll introduce is Alejandra Villamoguez. She is the policy manager for the Partnership for College Completion. She manages the partnership's research project and leads a few policy areas. As a former amazing education practitioner, she is passionate. She is a passionate educational advocate and policy professional with a strong background in community-rooted advocacy and data analysis. And then today presenting with us, we also have Laura Hamilton. Um, she is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced, and the co-founder of the Here Lab, which co-wrote the report with PCC. Her books include Paying for the Party, How College Maintains Inequality, Parenting to a Degree, How Family Matters for College Women's Success, and most recently, Broke, The Racial Consequences of Underfunding Public Universities. Her work examines the ways in which post-secondary organizations and higher education funding structures work to create and maintain racial and class inequalities. And then last but not least, we have Abrahamson, who is the Director of Policy and Research for the Partnership for College Completion, where he works on policy and practice that can improve equitable college access, affordability, and accountability in Illinois. Mike joined the partnership in 2018 after earning a master's degree from the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Before starting at PCC, Mike worked as a fellow for the Chicago Mayor's Office and for 1 Million Degrees. Oh, I didn't read this one bit of Alejandra's bio. My apologies. She also holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Arizona and a master's degree from the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Alejandra to kick us off.
You're on mute, Alejandra.
Sorry. Thank you, Jessica. Um, is my screen sharing okay? Can we see the presentation?
Sí.
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to just take a second to introduce myself. I'm Alejandra Villamoguez. I work for the Partnership for College Completion, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Mike and Laura Hamilton, who's at the Here Lab. You heard our bios already, so I won't repeat much of that, but I do want to share some of the background of how our collaboration came to be. So the Here Lab is really spearheading work on wealth inequality and financial aid. You heard Laura's bio, and she has been publishing things on this topic for a while now. And in 2024, the Here Lab produced a report on the need for a supplemental Pell Grant that includes wealth-based aspects into the formula. So because of the Here Lab's organizational work and PCC's organizational work on college access and completion, our networks kind of brought us together, and we really have been able to come together to take a state look at the need for reforming financial aid at the state level. So this report takes a look at national data as well as state data from California, Illinois, and New York, with this presentation really focusing on Illinois data. Right. So I want to start by really defining the two terms that we're going to be using a lot today, income and wealth. Income really is we argue today that as college has gotten more expensive, income has become an inadequate measure to really measure a financial ability to pay for college. So, for most families, income covers immediate needs for housing, food, medical care, and there's little left over at the end of a typical month. Um, Being able to keep up with the rising price of college then hinges more on a student's access to wealth rather than income. And when we're talking about wealth, we're going to be specifically talking about resources, these assets that include things like savings account, investments, real estate, business revenue, resources that families are able to leverage towards things like risks and investment. So I'm going to take us through a look at median net worth across the state of Illinois before diving into the Chicagoland area. This map is median net worth across the state, and dark red indicates areas of low median net worth, and the dark blue represents high levels of median net worth. I want to point your attention to the key really quickly because I think the colors are a little deceiving. My mind wants to think that white indicates a sort of middle level of net worth, but if you look at the key, you see that that's still in the bottom third levels of net worth. So anyway, as you look across the state outside of the Chicagoland area, we really see a lot of light orange to medium orange colors, which indicate lower levels of net worth. So we see that rural regions really have a lower median net worth. And then when we look at Chicagoland area, focusing on this northeast portion of the state, that's where we see really wealth inequality. Dark blue regions show where the highest levels of net worth where we see the highest levels of net worth across the state. The area with the highest levels of median net worth are just above the city of Chicago in Chicago Northeast, sorry, Cook County Northeast. And where we see the lowest levels of median net worth are in the south side of Chicago. So now diving into Chicago, the map that we just looked at spelled out wealth inequality across the state. This chart here looks at wealth and income inequality together, just to really paint a picture of how different those two are. So the orange bars on this chart show the differences in median household income across different racial and ethnic group. We take this data, by the way, from a report, our new report by the New School released in 2024. But the biggest difference that they report, biggest difference that they report in median income is between Black families and white families, a difference of about $56,000. The difference, however, when you look at median wealth, which is shown in blue, is much, much more drastic. Okay. And now we also want to look at differences in wealth across racial ethnic groups when also disaggregated by educational attainment. So while wealth inequalities you'll see persist across people groups, even when factoring education levels, you can see here that the bachelor degree completers of most of these selected racial ethnic groups are more likely to accrue higher levels of wealth than those with less than a bachelor's degree. So calling back to some of what Jessica was sharing earlier. All right, so we've talked so far about wealth and income as distinct dimensions of economic need. And wealth inequality in Illinois is much sharper than income inequality, especially in the Chicagoland area. These two distinct dimensions of need, then, wealth and income, should be considered in financial aid formulas, since we really think that a family's ability to afford college will be a function of both access to income and access to wealth. So I want to invite you to take a look at this donut chart. It includes a representative sample of Illinois FAFSA filers for 2019-2020. So we divide economic need into four different groups: not disadvantaged, low wealth only, low income only, and dually disadvantaged. So families might be disadvantaged by low income only. This is the small green portion of the donut chart. That's 13%. Or families can be disadvantaged by low wealth only. That portion is a little bit larger at 22% in orange here. And then among this sample of FAFSA filers, the largest share of families was not disadvantaged by wealth or income, meaning they had access to both. And that makes up almost half of this filers in this sample, almost 45%. So we, though, want to focus your attention to the 20% represented in purple. So this is almost 1/5 of FAFSA filers who are both low income and low wealth. In our report, we're going to refer to this group of students as dually disadvantaged. We'll talk about how dually disadvantaged students are different than their peers who have similar levels of household income, but less access to wealth. And Laura's going to talk about how we see different outcomes for these groups of students. But something I want to say about why dually disadvantaged students just have unique needs in college. Um, something that I hear my colleague Mike mention a lot is that too often a student's ability to complete college hinges on whether they're able to pay for an unexpected medical bill or unexpected mechanic bill. And what he's really talking there is about access to wealth. And I think if we all take a second to think about our own networks, we probably know someone who started their bachelor's degree or associate's degree and then were faced with something an unpredicted medical cost, or maybe an unpredicted cost of other sort, and weren't able to complete. So this is why this matters to us, and this is why we're diving into why wealth should be included into state aid formulas. And I'm gonna pass it to Laura to talk about the findings in the report.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for that, Alejandra. All right, next slide, please. So let's take a look at how the Student Aid Index, which is formerly known as EFC, considers the income and assets, just so we can understand how state aid, which relies in part on SAI, doesn't devote enough attention to folks who are duly disadvantaged because of lack of attention to wealth. The SAI is calculated by a federal formula that considers family income, both taxed and untaxed, family assets, family size, and number in college. Uh, Assets are treated very differently than parental income in the calculation of student need. Income is really the driver of this formula. Adjusted gross income, which is basically taxable income, is a major determinant of aid. Now, the FAFSA does include tax and income allowances, which reduce the reported income to around a quarter to 50% of income. However, that's still a much larger share of parental income that is counted than parental assets. Uh, while parents' contributions from assets are included, they are multiplied by an asset conversion rate of 5.64%. So this means that only 5.64% of parents' counted assets were considered as part of the expected family contribution toward college. And there's no such conversion rate on income after allowances. So to put this in real terms, let's say that your family has $200,000, which is a lot of money, set aside in a 529 account for your child. Now that account can only be used for educational purposes. It's really enough to put a student through 4 years of education at a public university in the state of Illinois and many other states. In this situation, only $11,280 of that 529 account shows up in this formula. Most importantly, someone who has no 529 account and zero assets appears to only be disadvantaged by a little over $11,000 in assets relative to the dependent whose college is effectively paid for. Next slide, please. In Illinois, eligibility for the Illinois Monetary Award Program, or the MAP, the state financial aid system, is not sensitive to wealth differences. This is in part because it's centered on the SAI formula. So here you can see the formula for the MAP. It starts with college costs, including tuition and fees, as well as living allowances. Student resources are then subtracted from college costs. Now, these resources are determined in part via an adjusted SAI, along with a minimum self-help amount of $1,800 and 80% of the federal Pell Grant eligibility. The adjustments to SAI here are solely inflationary. They do not allow the SAI to go below zero, and they only replicate the invisibility of parental wealth as they rely on the SAI formula and parental contributions that utilize that 5.64% asset conversion factor. So finally, the award is the smallest of one of three, eligibility amount derived by the formula, tuition and fees, or the max award of $8,400. Now, because parental assets are such a small portion of the SAI, students who are both low wealth and low income end up looking very similar in their MAP awards relative to their peers who are low income only and have some access to family wealth. Next slide, please. Because Illinois' need-based financial aid programs are not designed to target wealth, they are not sensitive to the dual disadvantage of students who are both low wealth and low income. You can really see this by examining the distribution of aid by multidimensional economic status. But even at four-year institutions in the state, which is on the left side here, the difference in annual aid between low income only and duly disadvantaged students is only $340 in the state of Illinois. So that means a low income only student and a student who are duly disadvantaged receive basically the same amount of aid in Illinois as in the rest of the US. This amount is likely much smaller than the difference in actual financial need between students with $0 in wealth and students who have family wealth on which to draw. The difference in awards is especially small at two-year institutions where duly disadvantaged students only receive $50 more on average than similarly low-income peers who have some access to family wealth, which is to say that duly disadvantaged students at 2- and 4-year institutions in Illinois are receiving just a small bit more than their peers who are only low income. And even this slightly greater amount for the duly disadvantaged may simply reflect income differences within the low income category. Among low income students, those who are low wealth have even lower average income than those who are low income but high wealth. Next slide, please. Low wealth as an unaddressed dimension of financial need is also reflected in the higher borrowing of low wealth borrowers. Here we show the predicted borrowing of low income students in Illinois and the US, only varying their access to wealth. In Illinois, even in terms of borrowing in just the course of 1 year, low wealth predicts $1,850 a year more in borrowing compared to higher wealth peers with a similar income. So we're holding income constant here and we're saying, okay, if you have no wealth versus some wealth, the duly disadvantaged are going to have nearly $2,000 more a year in borrowing. This gap, by the way, is higher in Illinois than it is in the US overall. Put another way, holding income constant at $20,000, the predicted borrowing of low wealth students is substantially greater than the predicted borrowing of high wealth students, and that difference is statistically significant. In short, at the same level of wealth, a wealth buffer seems to, at the same level of income, a wealth buffer seems to help students borrow less. Students without the wealth buffer are likely to borrow more relative to their same income level peers. Next slide, please. Indeed, using national data, we found that low wealth students in general borrow more over the course of their entire college. This figure comes from our national estimates. It displays the regression adjusted mean of total undergraduate borrowing 12 years from the start of college by wealth quintile. And the fifth wealth quintile is the highest and the first is the lowest. And we adjust by a number of factors in this, so we control for several other factors. Students in the lowest wealth quintile borrow nearly double what their peers in the highest quintile borrow during college, which this is slightly older data at that time, was a difference of roughly $1,600 compared to $16,000 compared to $8,000. So double the amount for low wealth students. So as family wealth increases, student borrowing significantly decreases. Next slide, please. This table similarly reflects national data, but the takeaway points are relevant in every state. These differences in access to aid for low wealth students have real consequences. Higher borrowing and greater economic need for low wealth students, especially those who are dually disadvantaged, translates into stark access and completion gaps. So here you can see how different income and wealth quintile combinations are associated with the transition into higher education and the completion of a four-year degree. In general, we can see that as either income or wealth increases, so does the predicted probability of making a given transition, whether it's entry to college in blue or college completion in green. And you can see the greater likelihood of making a transition by the color gradient. Lighter colors indicate lower probabilities, and they are clustered near the bottom left section of the matrix. And darker colors indicating higher probabilities are found towards the top, the right, and the top right sections of the matrix. The very top right, which is in cell 5-5, and the very bottom left, which is cell 1-1, highlight the sheer extent of the disparities between the dually disadvantaged and the dually advantaged, respectively. The gap is an astounding 39 percentage points for access and 51 percentage points for BA completion. The table also reveals the ways that wealth and income, both independently and in concert with each other, shape access and completion. For example, we can look at differences between students who are dually disadvantaged and singly disadvantaged by income. A student who is in the lowest wealth and income quintiles has a 52 percentage point predicted probability of enrolling in higher education. A peer in the same income quintile, but with moderate wealth in the third wealth quintile, has a 61% predicted probability of enrolling. This is a difference of 9 percentage points. We see a similar difference in the likelihood of BA completion conditional on enrolling. The dually disadvantaged have only a 20% predicted probability of completion, but a similarly low income peer in the second wealth quintile gains 5 percentage points, and a peer from the same low income quintile who has moderate wealth in the third wealth quintile gains 10 percentage points with a 30% predicted probability of completion. Next slide, please. Now there is a solution. We can target low wealth students with state need-based aid, especially those who are dually disadvantaged by both wealth and income. It is actually possible to do this right now using the FAFSA data that we rely on for many of the analyses that you saw above. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is because the FAFSA asked respondents to report on a fairly large array of assets. These include money and cash, savings, checking accounts, time deposits, money market funds, net worth of businesses or investment firms, reported as zero if it's negative, real estate, which excludes the primary residence, vacation homes, income producing property, trusts, stocks, bonds, derivative securities, mutual funds, and tax shelters, qualified educational benefits, or education savings accounts. Next slide, please. What's not included in the FAFSA does not collect data on home equity and retirement savings. So because of this, the FAFSA counted assets are lower than the value of all household assets as measured in representative surveys such as the Survey of Consumer Finance. However, in our work, we've shown that the distribution of FAFSA counted asset values has strikingly similar structural characteristics as the distribution of total household assets and total household net worth. That is, while FAFSA counted assets do not total all the assets that a household owns, they do a good job of identifying a household's relative position to other households. Households that have home equity and retirement savings tend to have other assets included in the FAFSA, while those who do not have home equity or retirement savings do not have FAFSA counted assets. FAFSA does not request information on debts. However, debt can be really misleading in part because wealthier families have higher debts because they have access to strong credit and high amounts of what is considered to be good debt, such as for real estate, property, and vehicles with favorable repayment terms. Next slide, please. In fact, those in the top 20% of the income structure actually have the largest debts. You can see this in the red circle. These are pricey mortgages, vehicle loans, and the like. A $500,000 mortgage is not necessarily a liability in the truest sense of the word. Rather, it's an investment. Please note that debts are quite small for families in the bottom 20% of income. Thus, only working with asset data in the FAFSA is not a problem. We can easily identify those households in the bottom, middle, and top of the distribution using assets alone. Can we go back a slide? Is that possible? Thank you. Finally, one additional feature of the FAFSA is exemption from asset reporting for households from low-income backgrounds, previously referred to as the Simplified Needs Test. In 24 through 25, dependent students did not need to complete the assets portion of the FAFSA if their parents' adjusted gross income was less than $60,000 and they met a few other criteria. We utilized imputation techniques, drawing on other information available in our data to estimate the family wealth for those with the missing asset data. There are at least two options Illinois might take to ensure there's adequate information on the assets of these filers. So one option is to require students from low wealth backgrounds who do not report asset data with the simplified FAFSA to submit a simple attestation regarding their lack of financial assets. And this is very similar to what they do regarding their lack of income assets. We're saying we could do the same thing with, this is what we do with the lack of income. We could do the same thing for financial assets or wealth. Another is to require those seeking to receive financial aid due to low wealth to complete the asset portion. Now, the first option, though, would considerably reduce administrative burden, but neither option actually requires a substantive change to the FAFSA form or what it collects, which we know can be a real problem given some issues that we've had in recent years. All right, next two slides, and I'm going to hand it over to Mike.
Hey everyone. Maybe you're thinking the same thing that I thought when I first saw this research from the original report from the HERE lab 3 or 4 years ago, I think, which is I think an incredible potential game changer for our policy, which very much or very it usually looks at income, right? And never looks at these metrics of wealth derived from FAFSA forms. The questions that I had were, how do you actually implement this into, for us, state level policy? And that's the question I'm going to try to answer today. I've got two different areas that we can incorporate this into state level policy, both which could have massive effects, positive effects on student completion and potentially student enrollment as well. And the first one of those is our formula for public universities. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that this is the simplest way that I can talk about the public university funding formula, which is at PCC. This is our top legislative priority over the last couple of years, or really 6 or 7 years, has been a top priority. Basically, in a couple sentences, Illinois does not have a method for how it currently funds its 12 public universities. And partly because we have no method, the state has disinvested. We invest about half of what we used to in our state universities. So basically, that pie has shrunk in half over the last 20 years or so. And we don't have any method for how we divide up the pie, which makes it really hard to ask for the pie to grow again, right? If we don't have any method. We've been working on that in a commission that was started with legislation in 2021. That commission met, I think, almost 60 times. It was a 33-member commission, and a lot more people participated. And we end up coming out of that with a proposal for a formula that wouldn't just bring Illinois, up to speed with funding formulas, but it would make us innovative and have basically the first funding formula for universities that actually accounts for what students need at each university. So how does it work? It's complex, but I'll describe it as simply as I can. First, the state would look at the population of each university and using research on what amount of additional funding per student we would need to get up from a graduation rate that we have now, around 63%, to closer to a 70% aggregate graduation rate. It uses that while looking at the student populations to estimate how much additional spending each university would need. Then it looks at the students again at each university and looks at research about what additional marginal, like what is the additional amount that we would need to spend to start narrowing the disparities that we see by subpopulation in those graduation rates. So one of the main things that's used there, as you can imagine, is income. So you can put a pin in that and I'll come back to it. Then we look at, oh, sorry, if it's still on this slide, then we look at the resources each university has in order to currently cover its costs, right? The main thing that we look at are how are we currently giving out the funding that we are giving out? Because there's a hold harmless in this legislation that says no university would get less than they did before this legislation. We look at first that pot of money, right? We know it's not enough, but how much is each university getting right now from the state to serve its students? And then we calculate a more equitable measure of what can they collect in tuition and fees from their students. Well, as you can imagine, again, we use income in that calculation of the resource profile, is what it's called. So then we just subtract step one, how much money each university needs, from step two, how much, well, we subtract step two, how much each university has from what from the total they need, and you have a gap for each university. You add up all the gaps together, and you have this $1.7 billion of additional annual funding that we estimate that Illinois needs. That is obviously a large number, but it would put us back to around how we funded universities in the early 2000s when Illinois was looked at as a model for public university, for basically as a public university system. So really quickly, I'll just gloss over on this next slide that we don't expect to get that $1.7 billion overnight. So it also matters how you give out. Let's say you're giving $135 million of funding next year for this formula. Well, we give it out based off of how far an institution is away from adequacy, its adequacy gap, both in terms of percentage and in terms of dollar amount. So those are the two factors that it uses. All right. So now getting into what I originally previewed, how can this formula, which we're, both still trying to pass and also working on, the details of, how can it incorporate this wealth discussion, wealth metrics that we were talking about earlier? Slide. So there's three possible ways, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first is a student contribution calculation. So I mentioned that each university looks at the resource profile, that how much it can collect from students. Well, if wealth was incorporated, just as Laura was talking about how impactful wealth is in a student's ability to actually pay for college, right? Like if they have $200,000 in a 529 or not, using those metrics that the FAFSA collects would more accurately determine how much students really can contribute. And for example, if a university has a large population of dually disadvantaged students or low wealth students, the state could contribute more because they would have a lower resource profile. On the other side, I mentioned that we do a calculation of what each university needs to serve its student populations. And if we can incorporate wealth in there instead of just income, we would again have a better sense of what those students need to succeed. So that could grow their university that I was mentioning, the example before, it could grow their adequacy target. So again, their adequacy gap would be larger and they would be targeted for more funding under this formula. A final way, this might be maybe the most ideal way to do it, but also not the most immediate, is if you can incorporate wealth into the MAP formula, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, then you can kind of you don't have to change as much in the formula because MAP will already incorporate the wealth elements, and then we already use like MAP, like the percentage of students that qualify for different levels of MAP in the formula too. So you could just incorporate that into the calculations uh, of the adequate and equitable formula, AEF. Okay. So yeah, on the next slide, we look at the potential benefits for Illinois students if we were going to incorporate uh, wealth into MAP. Basically, we estimate that we would have about 9,000 recipients of who, because we estimate that 9,000 MAP recipients are dually disadvantaged in certain terms of wealth and income. We just look at what would it be to give those students an extra $5,000 grant? Well, just with that grant infusion alone, we estimate using the research that we would have about 1,000 more college graduates per cohort. That is a really large number, right? That would affect the state's overall graduate population every single year. The cost of that would be less than $45 million, which, while not inexpensive, it is, it's basically a drop in the bucket compared to what we currently spend in higher education. And that's not even to mention what other states spend on higher education or even what we used to spend on higher education. The economic benefit of that is $153 million. So there's kind of a 3.5 to 1 benefit to cost ratio. I think that this vastly underestimates the ROI of this. If calculate every single quantitative or quantifiable benefit of a college degree, but also we know that there are a lot of less quantifiable benefits of college degrees that essentially what we're trying to do here, and I think the higher education policy space is to, realize to help realize the American dream, which is socioeconomic mobility. And you're seeing here that this $45 million infusion, we estimate could have 1,000 more students who would go from, being dually disadvantaged, low wealth and low income, to having a college degree, which can, be generationally impactful. So, finally, I'll wrap up here, and I encourage more in the Q&A, which is coming up. So on the final slide, we have our data needs and policy recommendations. I'm going to do these research and data needs in the opposite order. Basically, the first thing we need to do is just, these are estimations. We need to look at data and disaggregate what we're seeing in Illinois in terms of enrollment and outcomes by both income and wealth, so that we, don't have to make estimations as much as knowing what's really happening on the ground. And then we need to use that to do a full assessment of unmet need by wealth and income. So yes, like this $5,000 calculation, I think it's impactful to look at, but we want to do as thorough of a job of looking at that unmet need as possible. In terms of policy approaches to get this done, I've listed these 5 things. The first is to kind of solidify our state approach to aid and what we value in funding. That it sounds pretty wonky, but there are what we would call like just normative considerations here. Like the way that we approached it here is to give $5,000 more to dually disadvantaged students, but that's not the only way to approach it. And it does come down to values, right? Of how you would distribute additional money and how you maybe would distribute the current amount. Um, so we have to get together as a state with our stakeholders and decide what is our approach here. Um, we would also, this is, I think, the hurdle to get over. As Laura mentioned, we already collect this data on the FAFSA, and she went over how an attestation form could, help us shore up that data. But how we actually get that kind of attestation form, basically there is a jump to go from this research that we're showing and then actually implementing it in policy. And there's a couple ways to do that. You can do it on the mandating side, but there's, trade-offs there, or you can do it on the coaching side, where you're having high schools in the state, for example, say, hey, we know that this part of the form might say it's optional for you, but you should fill it out. This is where having the incentive in place really helps, right? Because if coaches can say, hey, there's a $5,000 additional scholarship potentially, or a $5,000 additional in state aid rather, potentially, then it can motivate. Um, I talked about how the MAP formula could address that economic need. And the last piece of of this for the MAP formula is incorporating that into the alternative application that was launched with the RISE Act. So that all students can participate in this additional potential funding. And finally, I already went through how we would include this in AEF. So I think we've got some time for Q&A and would love to answer any questions that you've added there. And I think you can continue to add.
Amazing. So yes, we can jump into Q&A. There was a couple questions in the chat that were, so great that the team decided that they're going to answer live. So I'll leave it to y'all. I think the first question was, what is it? Can you talk more about how wealth is currently defined and reported? For example, does the value of a family's home count? Are there any mechanics to ensure wealthy families accurate report their assets if wealth becomes more important in financial aid calculations?
I don't mind jumping in on this, and I think it echoes some concerns that were also in question three, which is like, how do we ensure wealth doesn't end up counting against students' financial aid or financial need, and what happens if the formula ends up calculating a higher expected student contribution using wealth than if only using income? So I think the important thing to point out here is that when we're talking about low wealth students, we're talking about students who have $0 to like maybe $100 to $500 in wealth. There is very little way for a family with a decent amount of wealth to hide it to that extent. It would be very, very challenging to do that, in part because the FAFSA collects so much information across like various places people like to put their wealth. So when we're looking at identifying this particular population in need, you can't hide that much assets in order to get into this category, I guess I should say. And on the issue of whether or not it would hurt students to include wealth in the calculation, it kind of depends on how the state decides to act. So ideally, you would be giving more aid to students who are duly disadvantaged. That isn't like a redistribution of aid necessarily. It's like the state committing to providing more support and targeting those students that need additional support so that it doesn't really impact anybody else's aid. As a researcher, that's, the kind of policy I would like to see. But the question I would ask then, even in a situation of redistribution of aid, is, if we only have so much money that we're giving, it's important to make sure that we're putting it in the pockets of the people who are most impacted, even if that means that somebody that is, slightly less impacted would receive slightly less. It becomes, in a zero-sum game, you have to decide how to distribute the aid. I'll do one more because it's related, and then I'm going to stop and let anybody else jump in, which is are you concerned about legislators worrying about disincentivizing saving for college, and how would you respond to that objection? I think it goes to the general point that it's difficult to hide your assets. So you may not save for college in a 529 account, but that money is going to appear somewhere in your assets. It's going to appear in your checkings, your savings, your stocks, your bonds, your additional investment properties. So even if you're not saving for college, it's going to show up in your assets elsewhere. So it shouldn't be too much of a disincentive, because the money is still like visible. You're not going to help yourself by not saving for college. All
Well,
right.
oh, and I was gonna ask on that too. I'm just asking you questions, but in that case, like there are still enormous tax benefits to saving in a 529. And if you have $300,000 put into a 529, you're probably not putting it in there in order to like hoping that you are also going to qualify for the $5,000 low income, low wealth award, right? So, like, I think, yeah, and look, we've had issues in the past in Illinois specifically on these kinds of things, a couple high profile cases. I know that we're in the news, but I do not think that that would be a serious thing. And actually, this is kind of a side note, but it is interesting, like, for all of the talk that we hear these days about a college degree, not, is it worth it or whatever, I have not heard any talk about from wealthy families about wanting to save up less for college, right? That should tell you a little bit about when they say, is college worth it? Who are they talking about? Is it worth it for? And, why we as a state, to circle back, need to make it the ROI calculation work more for low wealth students. Um, Getting into the very hard question that Dom asked in the chat. Okay, so it could increase the $1.7 billion asking amount for AEF, or it could not. It totally depends on how you incorporate it. There's a trade-off there where if you're incorporating it, you can just basically make the current calculations more equitable by targeting the adequacy target and the resource profile to the universities that are truly enrolling more low income, low wealth students instead of just income. I think about this a ton. Okay, so I have this chart, this table memorized. ISAC table 2.3D. I encourage you to look at it on the ISAC data website. It probably gets 2,000 views a year, and like 1,900 of them are me. But basically, it looks at the FAFSA application data for each institution. And it shows, so yeah, if you just look at percent of Pell students, you're going to see a range for our institutions between like what, 25 and 60% or something. If you look at this, which is the median income, so it's not even looking at wealth, but median income for FAFSA filers applying with their first choice as each institution, you'll see one of our public universities, their average median income of applicants is like $24,000, and another one is like 200,000, like maybe $180,000. The reality is that we have huge differences that we're not currently accounting for. You also can look at now student parent data. There are some institutions that are 200 times more likely to enroll students who are parenting. Like there's huge factors that are going into college that factor into college going and success that I think we're not accounting for now. So I think it's funny like how easily we get moored into the status quo, and then now this is just even moored into like what we currently have in this formula. But the reality is like whether you're just distributing the current amount that we're calling for or additional money, it would be a more accurate and more effective way of doing that.
Jim has a question. To what extent do you anticipate resistance in Illinois? And then we'll add California too, since Laura, you're here. Oh, well, no, actually, no. Only Illinois for this one, I guess. To the mandated data. No, no. Okay, I'll keep going back and forth. We're going to do both. To what extent do you anticipate resistance in Illinois to mandating data collection on wealth and changing to the math formula? So pushback, arguments against it.
Oh, maybe I can start. I'll start with the Illinois political situation. It's kind of a less and more situation, or no and yes, or basically the beautiful thing about this, and like, you see this original report and it's like such a game changer, or, both reports, it's such a game changer, is that the data is already collected. We're already collecting the data. It can be it's basically a technical issue, right? We're collecting the data. We're just not collecting all of the data, which is less, I think, a much, much lighter political push than, hey, we need to collect this new info on you or whatever. Like, I don't think we'll get as much pushback there. And for both questions, I think a lot of it is about what program you're setting up and how you're doing that. So the $5,000, if you were going to go the route of 5,000 additional dollars to dually disadvantaged students, I think you wouldn't, if you could get over the hurdle of, that $45 million additional, whatever, I think you're going to have a lot less of the pushback on either one or two, because it's maybe a little bit on the changing the map formula, but it is just an addition, and we see less, again, with status quo bias, less in just adding something there. And I think it's such a compelling case for it. And in terms of data collection, I think it's way easier to get people on board with it. Again, like it's one thing if you're doing an unfunded mandate to college counselors and saying, hey, tell your students this thing. It's another to say, like, hey, tell your students this thing and they could get 5,000 more dollars for college. Like college counselors really care about their students, like even if they have large caseloads. And I think like I mean, actually in our, Alejandra worked on our, recent report on accountability, and it showed the huge difference that having resources makes along with the mandate. I think if there's resources along with the mandate, it would really, really help this launch that new policy.
Tell us more about it, Alejandra.
The accountability report, or
Your thoughts on the question and or the accountability report.
yes, yes. No, I don't have too much to add to what Mike already shared, but I think my main takeaway is that if a family will get a grant, a $5,000 grant in addition to their current MAP grant as a result of giving a little more information. I think it's a positive thing and will likely be received well by families and counselors. I think I know not as much technically about the MAP grant as Mike does. I think you talked about it a little bit already. But from what I understand, the ISAC is really moved to fund equitably. So I think, yeah, if the case is compelling, then ISAC, the distributing agency, would be hopefully likely to change the MAP formula.
Hopeful to hear, fingers crossed, if that helps in any way. And Laura, what do you think about in terms of that work happening in California? How's it looking over there?
Good. I mean, we're in the early stages, but I would say, sort of echoing both the points of Mike and Alejandra, is that these these data are in the FAFSA, and all that is required is for a small subset of people who's meet particular criteria that normally don't report on their assets to report on their assets, or attest that they have less than X amount of dollars in, in savings, checking, stocks, bonds, etc., which is pretty simple. So the data burden here is not a large lift. Uh, in terms of California, yeah, we're similarly looking into modifying state programs, which look a little different than in Illinois, trying to figure out how to directly incorporate attention to dually disadvantaged students. So about the same stages as is here. Um, Maybe, I don't know, we only have like 1 minute. I don't know what you want to do, Jessica.
One more question. Is there Well, I'm gonna ask my questions. Sorry, Shelby. But I was really curious to hear how undocumented students and students from mixed status family played into this conversation about, financial aid resources, especially from the state. Especially like how could the funding formula benefit them, and also how would they sort of play into navigating these state, I guess, application when they don't have always the ability to present these financial aid documents, especially, with FAFSA.
Well, I'll just say that undocumented students tend to be, on average, pretty low wealth because there are a lot of barriers to the acquisition of wealth. So they would be recipients of this depending on the state policies. I don't know if Mike or Alejandra can speak more to financial aid for undocumented students in Illinois.
Unmuted at the same time. Um, so your question is how it plays into this conversation, how they could benefit in Illinois.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we wanted to make sure that we were thinking of as many groups of students as possible. And we know that undocumented students in Illinois are eligible for state aid. So I think the great thing is that when a student is not eligible for federal aid, and our state does, then our state has the ability to just make it that much more likely for a student to enroll and complete. Um, so yeah, I think our state has an even more important role in making sure that students are getting adequate aid. Or, I don't think it's adequate. It's not close to adequate, but getting closer to adequate. Um, and as far as how it can get done, I think Laura mentioned a simple sort of attestation form that people could fill out if they wanted a grant. I think it doesn't have to be overly burdensome to report. It can be a statement, like as simple as a statement that says, I don't have assets in XYZ areas.
Yes, I'm sure families would appreciate just like a way to get through the applications in an easier manner. Well, thank you so much, Alejandra. We're gonna close off with your point. Thank you, PCC. Thank you, Here Lab, Laura. I appreciate y'all. And yeah, excited for the work that y'all are doing. Have a great rest of your day.